As dawn broke on the morning of the 8th of September 1940, exhausted rescue crews took stock of the devastation around them. Since 8 o'clock the previous evening, London's docks area had been pounded by waves of German bombers. Finally, they left as the cloak of darkness began to lift. Along the south coast, troops had taken up their battle stations. At the height of the bombing, the chiefs of staff had issued the code word Cromwell, meaning that an invasion was imminent. They had seen the massive aerial bombardment that had preceded the invasion of Poland the year before, and the destruction of Rotterdam as the German forces advanced through the Low Countries. Now it was the turn of Britain's civilian population to experience the war at first hand. This first Blitz would last 8 months, although the capital and other British cities were bombed many times throughout the war. How people coped in the face of nightly death and destruction was to become the stuff of legend. As civilians and rescuers picked their way through the smouldering wreckage, nobody had any idea how long this would last or how the experience would change the country for decades to come. The Blitz had begun. London in 1939 was home to roughly 1/5 of Britain's population, covering an area of 750 square miles. As it was also the heart of the British Empire and the seat of government, London was always going to be a major target for any bombing campaign. Defending such a large area was always going to be difficult, and the city was also close enough to continental Europe to be within range of bombers, which, even using rudimentary navigational instruments, was quite easy to find simply by following the River Thames, especially on a clear night.
As part of its preparations for dealing with the anticipated aerial assault in the months before the Second World War, the British government carried out a number of large-scale exercises involving ARP personnel, aircraft and fire and ambulance services. These helped focus the mind on the very real risk of large numbers of casualties from bombing and gas attack.
Although the exercises helped prepare the emergency services for what was to come, they did little to calm rising concerns about the lack of adequate shelters for so many people. The London Underground was an obvious solution, but the authorities were worried that many would choose to stay in the safety deep underground rather than go to work and support the war effort. The authorities also worried that morale and public order could break down. The issue was not properly resolved until after the bombing began in 1940. Indeed, the Blitz had been raging for barely 2 weeks when the civilian population made the decision for themselves and began using the underground stations as shelters. There was no alternative but to adapt them to provide some basic facilities. As an alternative, the government issued a DIY shelter called the Anderson Shelter, which was designed to accommodate up to 6 people.
Only that when we had to stay in these shelters, we had candles and oil lamps, and of course the atmosphere was pretty horrible, and we'd get condensation running down the sides of the shelters. It was very unpleasant. Yes, I do remember that.
Of course, they were fine for those with gardens, but many Londoners lived in high-density housing where the only shelter was a basement. The government also authorised the building of surface shelters and, as a last resort, trenches. The surface shelters were poorly built, and many people were killed as a result of them collapsing. At the same time, nobody wanted to use a trench which was open to the elements during winter. Although the public had been warned to expect bombing on the outbreak of war, there was a tension about what would happen in the weeks to come. To make matters worse, air raid sirens sounded less than 30 minutes after Britain's formal declaration of war on the 3rd of September. It was a false alarm, but the experience did little to steady edgy nerves.
My mother was in our front garden, which was the opposite garden to what we were in, and the vicar come rushing up the garden screaming, "Don't panic, don't panic, don't panic," and everybody was just looking at him, not quite sure why he was doing it. So it was, we knew that there was going to be a war. I mean, it was fairly obvious, you know, that it had to be.
I lived in East Dulwich in South London, and on the day war broke out, I was in the back garden with my father and my uncle digging the foundations to put in the Anderson shelter. Around about 11 o'clock, my mother came out and told us there was an important message on the radio, and we all went indoors, and that's when the war was declared. After that, we went back out into the garden, and very shortly after that, the air raid sirens went, which was obviously a false alarm, but that was the first day of the war.
I got a taxi job to take two old ladies up to London, and they were absolutely panic-stricken. And I got them in the taxi, all luggage loaded up, and the siren went about 11 o'clock. I always remember it. And these old girls, I thought I was going to go potty. I had to stop where I was top of the hill, where I'd only got them in the car 10 minutes, had to stop so they could go down the shelter. And of course the shelter had only just been sort of built, it wasn't, you know. When they came out, when the all clear went, they were covered in chalk, had the gas masks on.
The turmoil in the cities did not end with the sounding of the all clear. When it became clear that war was inevitable, the authorities planned for the evacuation of around 4 million, mostly women and children, from urban areas. 1.4 million were evacuated from London alone. It was assumed that 90% of these would stay in private homes.
He came out with an expression once, which I don't know how important it is, but he said, if we're going to get killed, we're all going to get killed together. I don't know. It's hard to say really what the thinking was behind that. But that was what he said, and that was why none of us were evacuated.
The first wave of evacuations began on the 1st of September 1939, the same day as the first German tanks rolled into Poland. Over the next 3 days, 1.5 million children and women with infants were evacuated to the countryside, which was considered safe.
I was living in Gillingham, Kent, and I was 8 years old. And it was decided that we were to be evacuated away from the Medway towns, where bombing would probably be quite heavy because of the dockyard. And we were sent to a place called Sholden, which is in Deal, and right on the coast of Kent. Not a very sensible place to send us, but nevertheless, that's where we were sent.
Well, it's just people were sent all over the country. Some people went to Scotland, but that's where I ended up. We went to a place called Plint, and then from Plint they sorted us out, and my sister and I were sent down to Polperro. In actual fact, the school we had was in Polperro, and my sister was billeted in Polperro. I was billeted in a little village called Landsallows outside in the country. We had no schooling. The local school could not take us. We had an art master and a music mistress with us from London. We was put into a church hall. We used to go in the morning and sing songs like Where'er You Walk for about an hour with the music mistress. And then if the weather was fine enough, the art master took us around the cliffs drawing and painting. So I've done a lot of drawing. And that was about the existence of by lunchtime we'd finished. That was our schooling. So I didn't have any schooling from 12.
Well, we arrived and we were taken to a school, a tiny school, which had just 2 classrooms. And we were issued with a carrier bag which had some food rations. We had a gas mask and we had a large label on our coat to say who we were. And we were then marched across a very large field to our billets. When we arrived there, it was a tiny cottage. It had a very old-fashioned kitchen of its era. And I remember going to the kitchen and saying to the lady that I couldn't find the tap. And she said, that's because there isn't one. And there was a standpipe in a yard, and that standpipe supplied 4 cottages with water, and every drop had to be brought into the house. But partly we felt it was an adventure. We travelled there by train, and previous to that, the only time we travelled by train was to go on an outing or on a holiday, and I think we rather regarded as that we were going on a holiday. War didn't really strike us at 8 years old, what was going to happen.
Evacuation was voluntary, but the fear of being bombed and the fact that the schools in urban areas were closed persuaded parents to hand their children over to be cared for by complete strangers. The evacuation was an enormous logistical exercise which required the assistance of an army of volunteers to help smooth what was for some a traumatic experience. Teachers, officials from local authorities and railway staff all played their part, as well as over 17,000 members of the Women's Voluntary Service, the WVS, who provided refreshments in reception areas and billeting halls, as well as comforting tired and apprehensive evacuees at the railway stations. Many had little more than the clothes they were standing in. Arriving in the countryside was like landing on another planet. Both hosts and evacuees were often astonished to see how each other lived. Many children from the inner cities had never seen farm animals, and eating vegetables was a new experience. Likewise, their country hosts sometimes mistook urban poverty for parental neglect. Not surprisingly, some evacuees found life in the countryside boring and working on farms hard work, while others flourished in their new surroundings.
I was well looked after. I loved it down there. I mean, I got in with the fishermen. I used to go out local fishing and trawling up and down. The boats used to go out during the day and catching their fish stocks, and then during the day they used to lend us their small boats and give us all the tackle. We used to go out and catch fish for their crab pots. So we did them a favour and they gave us a day's fishing, and then often of a night I would go out there trawling for mackerel with them. So I really enjoyed myself down there.
But the waves of bombers that had been feared never materialised in the first months of the war, and despite the best efforts of the authorities, children began to drift back to their families. By January, over half of all those evacuated had returned to their homes. As schools were closed and parents were either working or in the armed services, the children were left to entertain themselves as best they could.
It didn't really affect my school life that much until I went to a school called the Elliott School, which was a central school in Southfields, and all that was then the most important thing that happened at that time was when they started to evacuate all the children, and my father would not allow us to be evacuated, and so I was literally didn't go to school for nearly a year. I ran with my friends. We ran the streets and we went around bomb sites looking to see what we could find on bomb sites and things like that, which was quite good fun then. And so they started to open up the schools One week they opened up Wandle Road School in the mornings, for example, and Magdalen Road School in the afternoons another week. And so that was how I started to go back to school. And that lasted until I was 14, and then I left school altogether and started work.
You have to pack up school in them days at 14, so you couldn't stay there and evacuate. I had to come back and work. And this was, say, I got a job with a firm called Electrical Installations in Victoria, and I used to cycle up to there. And then during a lot of the raids, we used to be paid, I think my wages was about 7 to 6 a week in them days, but we were paid 7 shillings a night to stay there fire watching. So to stay for a night fire watching was an extra week's wages virtually. And we used to stay up in the offices, and if the warnings went, we stand by with sandbags and things, mainly to put out incendiary bombs.
Children were not the only ones to be uprooted and moved about the country. There were about 70,000 people who, on the outbreak of war, found themselves designated enemy aliens.
I wouldn't have left if that wasn't declared alien protected area. It was too close to the coast. And again the policeman came and said, within 2 days or something, I have to leave.
Many were Jewish refugees who had fled Europe as the Nazis rose to power. Under a special arrangement, the men were allowed temporary visas on the basis that they were travelling on to the United States. They were accommodated in a large former First World War camp in Sandwich in Kent, known as the Kitchener Camp. Women were also allowed entry, but were only allowed to work in domestic jobs, while children were brought over on the Kindertransport trains.
What they did was trains stopped at several towns and cities, and children were brought into that in Cologne. They brought in a little girl, and she must have been 3 or 4, tiny. And she just didn't know what was going on, and she was crying. And her mother asked me, would I help her take care of her? So I did, and I don't remember how we ever got across the border, but I remember very well stopping in Holland, and the Jewish ladies coming to, and I don't think they were all Jewish, I think they were non-Jews too, coming to the station and bringing goodies and drinks, and I remember helping the little girl. She wanted chocolate.
Initially, there was a fairly relaxed attitude to the presence of enemy aliens. But that changed in May 1940, when Germany invaded France and the Low Countries. Now there was a fear of the enemy within. All enemy aliens were rounded up, and many were sent to internment camps on the Isle of Man. Others were deported to Australia and Canada.
All these countries were overrun already. And that's when they just grabbed everybody, and put them into camps, okay? And that's how I ended up on the Isle of Man, being shipped there in the middle of the night, not knowing where to go. I was working. I was called to the administration, and there were these people from who were detectives or something, and they had the order that I had to pack my stuff up and come with them. There was another refugee girl in the same hospital, and she was there too. And we were first taken to Liverpool, okay, and overnight we were in Liverpool in a school. And we were always taken care of, physically taken care of, okay? But we had no idea where we were going, and thereby, or what would become of us. And so we got to the Isle of Man in the middle of the night. The hotels, okay, and the food was financed by the British government. But whatever else extra we wanted, and there was things to buy, we had the money of our own. Anyway, we were there, we didn't know how long or whatever, and things settled in. And we did, but what we all knew was that the British did this in order to prevent what happened in the other countries, the Quisling experience. And so because they felt they couldn't do this slowly anymore, or what, time was running out, they just grabbed everybody and then slowly picked through one by one through with a tribunal and to see whether, and they did find people in this mass. They found a whole group of nuns among them, and they found other individuals who were really spies for Germany. And so the whole, and then because I was in training for nurse, I could help them out a little bit. And there was a little hospital on the island, and just for these refugees, and I could help there a little bit, and it was great. It was something to do, and I felt accepted. Okay, this feeling of being accepted was very, very important.
Despite public sympathy for the refugees, there was a nagging fear that there may be fifth columnists waiting for their call to action. Winston Churchill was convinced that the Germans' rapid advance through Western Europe was not just down to better tactics, superior weaponry and fighting spirit. There had to be fifth columnists at work behind the lines. And if they were present in Europe, then they were almost certainly at work in Britain. He demanded, and got, a new act passed rapidly through Parliament, the Treachery Act. There was only one punishment for anyone found guilty of breaching this act: death. On the morning of the 3rd of September, the Battle of Britain was nearing its climax. German bombers were attacking RAF targets, but they were creeping closer to the capital. On a quiet beach near Dungeness in Kent, 2 dinghies slipped ashore, carrying 2 men in each. They carried a radio set and enough food for 10 days. Their mission was to reconnoitre southern England in preparation for a German invasion. But their mission was almost over as soon as it started. One of the spies, a Dutch national, walked into a small pub, the Rising Sun, in Lydd, near their landing point. Unaware that the sale of alcohol was forbidden before 9 a.m, he ordered a bottle of cider. The landlady was immediately suspicious, not least because of his accent, and called the police. His 3 accomplices were quickly rounded up. All 4 were tried and sentenced in great secrecy. 3 of them were executed, the 4th released and then rearrested as an enemy alien. It is a measure of how worried the authorities were that roadblocks became part of everyday life. Even before the bombers came, the streets of London were already changing. Road signs were removed and replaced with signs directing people to the nearest shelters. As blackout regulations meant that the city was engulfed in darkness, specially illuminated signs were installed. Pavements were edged in white to try and provide pedestrians with some protection from cars unable to follow the roads in the dark.
In that first winter of the war, the blackout would prove far more deadly than any German bomber. Arduous and difficult as it was for the pedestrian, The blackout was a nightmare for the motorist. Despite the fact that private motoring had become increasingly restricted, the number of road deaths through the blackout soared. In fact, by January 1940, a staggering 1 person in 5 had suffered from some form of blackout-related accident.
Perhaps one of the most enduring mysteries is what happened to London's iron railings. Britain was in short supply of raw materials, and so there was a tremendous drive to encourage people to cut down on waste and recycle as much as possible. There were campaigns that encouraged people to put scraps of food in special bins to feed pigs. But it was metal that was most needed. Lord Beaverbrook, the press baron turned Minister of Aircraft Production, ran a campaign directed at women to get them to give up any pots and pans that contained aluminium so that they could be turned into aircraft. The idea spread to include iron for munitions. All around London, gangs of men set about removing all the iron railings they could find. Nothing was spared. The parks, garden squares, even the railings outside people's houses, all fell under the blows of sledgehammers and grinders, sometimes causing a lot of damage to the surrounding stonework.
The fate of many of these railings remains a mystery. Much of the scrap was found unsuited to its intended purpose. Was, as it has been suggested, some of it buried or even dumped in the Thames estuary? In a way, it didn't matter, as the scrap drive, like the other salvage campaigns, formed part of that common sense of purpose that has become known as the Blitz spirit.
As the phony war of the winter of 1939 dragged on, London appeared ready. It would be almost a year before the intense bombing campaign began against London, by which time Britain had had enough time to build up its defences. One of the most significant developments was the use of a new technology called radio direction finding, which later became known as radar.
We knew about it. It was called RDF in those days, radio direction finding, and we were told that we must never discuss it outside of the ops room. And there were 4 or 5 plotters who were dealing with the reports that came in from the radar stations. The rest of us, I don't know where it all came from, the Observer Corps, and nobody talks about them much, but the radar only worked as far as the coast. Once they crossed the coast, we used to get these, but they said, oh, we used to go to Stanmore to the filter room, and they sent us through the details of where the aircraft were.
We were the first and only squadron to start with to operate with radar. And we used to intercept incoming airliners from the continent and pretend we just happened to be in the same piece of airspace as they were at that time. And we weren't allowed to approach them closely or anything, but we had to report when we'd first sighted them how far away they were and what height and so on and so forth, which was checking on the radar stations who were directing us.
When we were in North Wales especially, we used to get a lot of information from sector ops on the state of the enemy, because the enemy was taking off in northern France, and of course the bombers used to take about an hour to get to height. So they would gradually form up over northern France or northern Belgium, and it would appear on our radar screens or sector's radar screen. We used to get that information. And that was really the most apprehensive part of our flight. The fighters took off a little later because they then had to form up before they could come across to England. So it was the period before the fighting that when we were having these messages passed to us to what was happening, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 plus, 150 plus, my God, and there are only 12 of us, sort of thing, you know, where do we start?
The German Air Force had also been working on its own radar system to help guide bombers to their target, even at night and in poor weather. The system was called Nickerbein, which means crooked leg. The lead bomber was guided to the target by following a radio beam from a transmitter on the continent. A series of audible dots and dashes helped warn the pilot if he was wandering off course. Once over the target, the lead aircraft would drop incendiaries, illuminating it for the other aircraft. The system was far from foolproof in that the beam could be bent, sending the bomber fleet off target. But on the night of the 14th of November 1940, the system worked perfectly. Coventry, which had already been bombed 17 times between August and October, was the target that night. Codenamed Moonlight Sonata, a large force of 515 bombers laid waste to the city in a series of raids that carried on through to the next morning. The first waves dropped high explosive, aimed at knocking out utilities like water, gas, electricity and phone lines. Roads were also cratered to make access even more difficult. The following waves then dropped more high explosive to crack open buildings and then more incendiaries to set them on fire. Over 500 people died in Coventry that night. 4,300 homes were destroyed and most of the city's buildings. Remarkably, although it would take months for the city to recover, war production was only slightly interrupted as many of the factories had been moved to the outskirts. The casualties would also have been a lot higher if it had not been for the fact that more and more people were leaving the city at night to sleep in open countryside. The Luftwaffe's success was also due to the British not knowing what the intended target was that night. The RAF was able to eavesdrop on the Luftwaffe's messages, having cracked much of its secret codes. Although the messages did not always present a complete picture at that stage of the war. Although it was known the attack was coming, the target was assumed to be London.
I worked in Hut 6, decoding the Luftwaffe messages, and shortly after that they developed some things they called a bomb, and we got sheets of numbers through, and we would have to try and turn them into plain language. They came through in groups of five letters, and we had. Nobody in Hut 6 spoke very good German. Most of us knew a little, but not a lot. But we could recognise it when we met. And then it went through to Hut 3 to be interpreted and evaluated. They had a little wooden tunnel between the two, and you put all your stuff in a wicker basket and pushed it through with a broom handle. It was very high-tech in those days. We were decoding messages from the Luftwaffe. Hut 8 did the naval work, and we did the RAF, did the Luftwaffe. And we would get these great sheafs of figures through, and we had something we called a crib, which was like a big sheet of paper with holes in it, and you moved it about, and certain things, the Enigma machine never ever produced one letter as itself, so it was never reproduced. And most of the German mentality is very disciplined. Everything would be in the same format, so you could get to quite often get into the message by decoding the first bits. They were always in the same format. And so we had plenty of machines. What we needed was the code books with the settings, because you set every day at midnight the code changed, and you took a pencil and pulled it round, had little cogs on it, and you pulled it round with a pencil and set it to the new setting for the day. And once you'd got those, you could decode the stuff. And that was what they captured that was so valuable.
Knowing that a raid was imminent was one thing. Intercepting it was almost impossible once the Germans switched to attacking at night. Although London was ringed by searchlight and anti-aircraft batteries, Britain lacked night fighter aircraft.
We really were reliant on ground control giving us instructions and pointing us in the direction of an enemy. That was about all we had at that time.
Early airborne radar systems were large and had to be installed in twin-engine bombers. Of course, these were slow and needed time to get to an altitude where they could find the enemy bombers. An early experiment used a radar-equipped bomber with a large searchlight mounted in the nose.
While we were at Tangmere, my pilot suddenly decided that he would go over to a Turbinlite flight that we had on the other side of the aerodrome. And of course, where he went, of course, I had to go. That was the rule in those days. And so I went there with some displeasure, I must admit, because I'd heard about these Turbinlites with a great big searchlight in their nose and mating at night with illuminated strips and carrying a ton of batteries and not even a pea shooter. And I wasn't very much pleased with the idea of doing that. But over to Turbinlites we went. But the theory was that you would be up at night and you would have a couple of Spits or Hurricanes formating on you by the aid of the illuminated strip on the wings, and I would then chase the enemy and get him close, and at a certain code word, once I'd got the enemy aircraft within searchlight range, there would be a code word sent to the Spit or Hurricane, and then on another code word which would send him out and above you to your left, ready for a dive. And on the next code word, he would commence his dive forward to get in more or less in front of you. And as he commenced that dive, my pilot would pull a lever and expose the searchlight, expose the enemy aircraft, and the Hurricane, which was diving down towards that area, would see him and shoot him down. Wonderful. I don't recall many night flights at all. The pilots, the Hurricane pilots or Spits, just did not like formating with us at night.
The Turbinlite was ridiculous because we already had the capability, without any lights but using radar, of following and closing in on an aeroplane. And the last thing in the world one wished to do was to advertise your presence by shining a great big light, which of course, fortunately, that ridiculous thing was stopped in about 1943.
John Cunningham was to become a well-known night fighter ace, and his exploits were regularly reported in the popular press. He was nicknamed Cat's Eyes, and his success was attributed to his extraordinary night vision, coupled to his eating carrots. The reason for this was to encourage the civilian population, especially children, to improve their meagre, heavily rationed diet by eating more vegetables. A campaign under the heading Dig for Victory proved very successful, as allotments sprung up in bomb sites all over the city, as well as in green spaces like the parks, as well as golf clubs and even tennis courts. Children helped by doing the weeding, and those on farms by picking fruit. By 1943, there were 3.5 million allotments in Britain, producing over 1 million tons of vegetables. Many people also kept ducks and rabbits to eat and chickens for eggs.
Rationing was supposed to make food available to everyone on an equal basis, especially once the U-boat campaign got underway and the bombing of Britain's ports intensified. However, shortages began to develop, and this led to an ever-flourishing black market. Farmers, for example, found they could get better prices on the black market than through the normal channels. Crime began to flourish.
Although the Blitz is usually portrayed as a time when the country came together, crime flourished. The blackout provided many opportunities for theft and violence, but the destruction of people's homes by bombing provided many more opportunities. People who had been bombed out of their homes were given financial support to get back on their feet. But the system was open to abuse, and there were plenty of people willing to submit fraudulent claims. Also, in the sometimes chaotic aftermath of a raid, looters were never far away to see what pickings might be found amongst the ruined homes and businesses.
Between 1939 and 1945, cases of reported crime in England and Wales rose by a staggering 57%. Hidden in these figures is the crime of looting, which in effect is a straightforward case of theft aggravated by the blackout and chaos of the war.
One of the most shocking examples of looting followed the bombing of the Café de Paris nightclub in London's West End. It might come as a surprise that there was still a flourishing nightlife despite the Blitz.
We would go up on the underground, which was took nearly an hour to get, because it's right at the end of the underground, the Piccadilly line, and then we would go into various hotels and nightclubs, which were much smaller. They were little places then, but we would dance and there were dance bands. In fact, it was sheer fortune that we weren't in that big raid on the Café de Paris that was bombed. We used to go there a lot, and we used to go to Savoy and Dorchester and Mayfair Hotel, and we had a really good time, and nobody took much notice of the raids, even when they were on. They were more of a nuisance than anything. There was a strange spirit about people. People accepted the fact that it was dangerous. You just thought nothing of it.
On the 8th of March 1941, the Luftwaffe mounted one of its largest attacks on London of the year. As the club was 20 feet underground, revellers in the Café de Paris assumed that they were safe. Bandleader Snakehips Johnson and his band had just begun their set when a bomb dropped down a ventilation shaft and exploded right in front of the stage. In such a confined space, the explosion had a devastating effect, killing 34 and leaving many more with horrific injuries. But what shocked rescuers was the fact that they had to force their way past looters, fighting amongst themselves as they ripped rings and jewellery off the dead and dying. The situation was so bad that a platoon of foot guards had to be stationed outside. The club remained closed until after the war. Although images of crowds of men, women and children sleeping on crowded platforms of London's Underground station remain some of the most iconic of the Blitz, only deep shelters could provide protection against a direct hit. Before the war, the government had not built them because of cost, time and fears that their safety would lead to occupants refusing to return to work, or that anti-war sentiment might develop. Although public morale held up, the Blitz provided many opportunities for criminals. There was a thriving black market trade in pitches, which was sold to people queuing outside tube stations as they waited for them to open. The only solution was to introduce some form of ticketing. Shelter marshals and wardens were appointed by the local authorities to issue reservation tickets. Around 10% of the accommodation was unallocated so that people who found themselves in the area in the event of a raid could use it. But tube stations were not as safe as people believed. A high explosive bomb could penetrate up to 50 feet through solid ground. The most destructive incident was on the 14th of October at Balham Station, when a bomb weighing over a ton fell on the road above the northern end of the platform tunnels. The crater was so large, a double-decker bus then crashed into it. The northbound platform tunnel partially collapsed, filling with earth and water from the fractured water mains and sewers above. Although more than 400 managed to escape, 68 people died in the disaster, including the station master, the ticket office clerk, and 2 porters. Many drowned as water and sewage from burst mains poured in, soon reaching a depth of 3 feet. Despite the dangers, civilians performed many extraordinary acts of courage. In recognition of their bravery, King George VI ordered that a new medal be struck.
The reason being was that the main highest award you could have was the Victoria Cross, but that could only be awarded to action in the face of the enemy, whereas the George Cross, as it turns out, couldn't. But at a particular time, King George became rather confused, in as much that he knew that during the war there were various actions that deserved a Victoria Cross but could not be given because it wasn't in the face of the enemy. It was to do with actions in the UK mainly, and this was to do with hospital workers, bomb disposal, and later the air raid wardens. Also all the emergency services, various actions that King George and his wife, during the course of their visits, which they did, they visited various areas around the country in 1940 and prior, and he became rather upset that he couldn't award a VC, so he decided that he would do his own medal, which he did. And he basically designed it himself. He doodled and got it into perspective, and it was subsequently done for him, but it was all his own doing.
The newly minted George Cross was intended to have the equivalency with the Victoria Cross, and was first awarded before the Blitz had even started. During the summer of 1940, German bombers had been probing British defences for weeks up and down the east coast. These were often tip-and-run raids in which aircraft would attack civilian areas with the aim of luring RAF fighters into a trap.
Nearly every night we would have an air raid warning and go and sit in the shelters. There's one incident that I remember. In the daytime when raids were, we became rather nonchalant about them, wouldn't take cover straight away. And walking along a main street in Gillingham one day, there was a raid on, everyone took cover. And these planes swept across, very low level, just chimney top height. So much so you could see the pilot sitting in there, and he waved to us, and so we waved back, and he went a little further on and dropped his bombs. It was a German plane without markings. So we said, as Mr. Mannering would say, it's a typical Nazi trick. You know? We all dived to the floor in shop doorways and unhurt.
On Thursday the 15th of August 1940, the Luftwaffe launched a huge attack from bases in Norway. Their targets were mostly RAF Bomber Command airfields. But a section broke away and bombed Bridlington, a small fishing port in Yorkshire. Over the next few days, the town was attacked again. Leading the ARP rescue team in Bridlington was Thomas Alderson. 3 times during that August, he burrowed through bombed houses to rescue trapped occupants. The risk was enormous, and in recognition of his courage, Alderson became the first civilian to receive the newly struck George Cross. Raids against British cities continued to spread throughout the war. Ports like Plymouth, Southampton and Portsmouth were frequently attacked. Although they rarely matched the intensity of the Blitz, they were devastating for those caught up in a raid.
One night there was a raid, and we were under, my sister and I and my mother were under the Morrison shelter. And my granddad was in the front room because he'd had a stroke, so he was living downstairs. And we went to bed, and raid started. Terrific noise, and could hear the gun going off, and we heard this drone. It kept going, and that got louder and louder, and then we heard this terrific whistle, and that got louder and louder, and then bang, terrific bang, and my mother thought we were buried, and she was, after everything dropped off the ceiling, and my mum thought we were buried, and she was shouting, "Help, help," and she wanted to put a light on. I said, "Don't put a light on." My sister wouldn't answer my mother because she was too frightened, and eventually the next door neighbour come in the front door, which had blown off, and come in to see if we were all right. So there was, everything was down, no glass in the window. My poor granddad had been blown off his commode, and my mother had to pick him up with my sister because she was a bit older than me and get him under our shelter because we had no ceiling. But all the doors had blown off, and it was terrific. And there was horses in the field, and apparently they'd all got blown to bits.
By 1943, aircraft from RAF Bomber Command and the United States Army Air Force were attacking German cities night and day. Hitler needed to demonstrate to the German public that the country could still strike back. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe mounted the first of a series of raids called Operation Steinbock. In Britain, it became known as the Baby Blitz. Ironically, perhaps, the first raid came the day after 800 RAF bombers had attacked Berlin. Although the raids used more Luftwaffe aircraft than in any other raid since the end of the first Blitz in 1941, they were nothing like as destructive, and although there were casualties, they were relatively light. The introduction of airborne radar into aircraft like the Beaufighter and the Mosquito meant that British night fighter defences were much more effective. ground defences had also benefited from the introduction of radar. The cost of the Luftwaffe was too high to maintain the operation. Many of the bombers failed to even reach their targets, and a rumour was circulating amongst the inexperienced crews that the RAF night fighters were using the Germans' radio beams to home in on their aircraft. Perhaps the most remarkable failure was the Luftwaffe's choice not to attack the assembly areas for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Europe. As well as failing to disrupt the build-up, the Luftwaffe's losses meant that their ability to mount any potential offensive against the Allied invaders was substantially reduced. After the failure of this conventional bombing campaign, the Nazi leadership sought unconventional ways to attack Britain. The Allied landings in France on June the 6th, coupled with the ending of the baby Blitz, brought a new air of optimism and relief to the people of London and other cities that had been heavily bombed. There was an expectation that the war would soon be over. But on the night of the 13th of June, Londoners were woken by a strange sound that some described as sounding like a motorbike without its silencer. A new Blitz had begun.
The government had known for some time that Hitler had been working on his so-called vengeance weapons. Information had been received from foreign resistance organisations, from intercepted Enigma and Ultra messages, and even from neutral governments in places like Sweden. However, when the attacks began, our defences needed to adapt and change how they operated, just as they had done back when the Blitz first started in September 1940.
The V-1 flying bomb delivered a ton of high explosive. The distinctive noise of their pulse jet engines, which cut out after a predetermined mileage, terrorised the population. They quickly became known as doodlebugs or buzz bombs.
I was six years old when they first started coming over, and I recall quite vividly going for a walk with my mother in the countryside in the summer of 1944, when quite violently she dragged me in a ditch, threw herself on top of me, and I remember her words so clearly. She was pointing at the sky saying, "Here he comes, Hitler on his motorbike." And this thing came clattering over the treetops with its tail on fire. So clearly do I remember that. I wasn't frightened at all. There was no reason why I should be frightened. My mother was petrified. Somewhere north of Sevenoaks the engine stopped and we heard the explosion, and she hurried me home.
The doodlebugs used to frighten people. When you saw those, they made a strange noise, boom, 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 boom. And when that stopped, down they came.
At first, there was little defence against them, as they were small and flew too fast for the fighters to catch them unless they were in a shallow dive. Their speed and altitude also meant that they were difficult to shoot down by the ground defences.
But they had to get through the defences, you know, the gunners on the coast, the fighters operating in the Weald of Kent, and then of course the goalkeepers. We refer to them as goalkeepers with the barrage balloons. Wonderful sight at night. You know, they glistened and they twinkled, and to me it was a magic sight seeing the barrage balloons all the way around the North Downs, all the way around London.
As over 100 V1s a day were being launched, the British public were demanding
Morale
solutions.
was pretty high. It was after D-Day. Our troops were over there. They were hassling the people on the launching sites, and suddenly we were under attack again. This was the second Battle of Britain, if you like. And there was anger, frustration.
Electronic measures like proximity fuses and gun-laying radar played a major part in turning the tide. 17% of all flying bombs entering the coastal gun belt were destroyed by guns in the first week on the coast. This rose to 60% by the 23rd of August and 74% in the last week of the month, when, on one day, 82% were shot down. In daylight, V-1 chases by intercepting fighters were chaotic and often unsuccessful. Even if the pilot managed to get close enough to fire his guns, the blast could be enough to damage his own plane. But the Allies had their own secret weapon to help in the fight against the doodlebugs: a jet aircraft. The Gloucester Meteor had the performance to catch a doodlebug, and although it was not really ready for operations, it was decided to rush it into service. On July the 12th, the first two Meteors of No. 616 Squadron arrived at Manston in Kent. They were a closely guarded secret and kept under covers at night. More joined over the next 2 weeks, and by the end of the month, the squadron was flying operational sorties, making No. 616 the Allies' first operational jet squadron. Although the Meteors had the speed to catch the doodlebugs, their four cannon were prone to jamming. It was because of this problem that the first doodlebug to be brought down by a jet happened in an unusual way.
We were scrambled on with instruction that the V1s were approaching London, and we were to intercept and destroy them. I was approaching Ashford and saw this V1 closed up to about 300 yards behind it. Pressed my trigger for the guns and nothing happened. And I looked around for my number 2, but he wasn't there. So I immediately thought, well, they operate on a gyro system. If I tip him, it'll go down. So I closed up on it, formatted on it, got my wingtip under its wingtip, and looked down to see where I was. Nothing on the trees underneath, so I just pulled back on the stick slightly, and over she went into the trees.
The V-1 Blitz against London continued until March 1945. During that time, over 6,500 were launched at Britain. Of these, 2,340 hit London, causing over 6,000 deaths and injuring around 18,000 people. But the V-1s also had a destabilizing effect on the population. By July, over 15,000 people a day were leaving London, either through official evacuation schemes or by their own means. It is reported that between 1.5 and 2 million people left the capital during this period. But by September, most of the V-1s were being shot down before they reached London. By establishing 3 lines of defence using fighter aircraft, anti-aircraft guns and barrage balloons, around 3,500 were brought down. But against its successor, there was no defence. It was on the 7th of September 1944, 4 years to the day since the start of the Blitz, that Minister of Works Duncan Sands announced that the Battle of London was now over. The very next day, a huge explosion rocked London. There was no warning, no air raid alert. This was something new. Over the next few months, around 1,400 V-2s were launched against Britain, of which 500 struck London. They were less accurate than the V-1 missiles, but since they travelled at over 3,000 miles per hour, they made no warning noise before impact. It was almost impossible to defend against them, apart from waiting for their launch sites to be overrun by the Allies advancing across Europe.
I recall talk about how suddenly there was no chance. You see, with the flying bomb, with the doodlebug, people could wait for the engine to stop, and they had about 12 seconds to take cover. They could go to the surface shelter, to the Anderson, to the Morrison indoors, and those people who lived in North Kent would go into the lime pits. Chislehurst Caves, of course, was very popular, the tunnels at Dover. But with the rocket, there was absolutely no chance at all. You were either alive or dead, and there was a different kind of fear. Terrifying, you know. We had 2 in Sevenoaks, 2 rockets. Gravesend had 2. The only 2 towns in Kent to get 2 in the town centre. But 60 of them fell in this part of Kent. And most of them were in London. 5 minutes from launch to impact, and towards the end of the V2 campaign, they were able to give, I think, a 90-second warning. But, you know, that by the time it reached us, you know, they were long expired. So, yes, people were terrified.
Britain also used its double-crossing secret agents to feed back false information, claiming that too many were overflying the capital. The Germans recalibrated the rockets so that many fell in less densely populated areas and open countryside in Essex and Kent. The last day that London was attacked was on the 27th of March 1945. Families in a block of flats at Hughes Mansions in East London were sitting down to breakfast when their building was hit by a V2. 134 people were killed in the blast, making it one of the most deadly V2 strikes. By the end of the war, over 2,700 people had been killed in V2 attacks and 25,000 seriously injured, and tens of thousands of homes and buildings were destroyed. Londoners had been blasted out of their homes, in some cases time and time again, and now this new terror arrived. They were tired, weary, and it was now cold. Tens of thousands of people had no roofs, no windows, no running water. Repairs were carried out at a vigorous pace, but after the V1s, a massive backlog remained, and many waited months for glass in their windows or tiles on their roofs. During the Blitz, there had been a sense of community, a stoic attitude, Britain in its finest hour. The V2 attacks caused a different response. Londoners were terrified, and large numbers fell ill with flu and other winter illnesses. At the height of the Blitz in 1940, there had been a defiant spirit. "London can take it," went the slogan. Now, after nearly 6 years of war, the mood had changed. The keep calm and carry on had given way to weariness. Large swathes of the capital and other major cities across Britain were in ruins. Food and clothing were in short supply. Victory in Europe seemed as elusive as ever. How much more could London take?
It was part of everyday life. I'd only known war, and it was just another incident in my life. I, again, don't remember being frightened because I was too young to be frightened. You know, you don't think you're going to die at all. But my parents were frightened. My mother started smoking, I remember. She didn't smoke, she was a non-smoker. During the war she started buying cigarettes. And my father chewed away endlessly on his pipe. The house was full of smoke. A lot to do with fear.
The end of the war in Europe could not have come soon enough. Freed from the threat of instant death, many in the capital went mad as it celebrated VE Day on the 7th and 8th of May 1945. For others, celebrations were muted, either because they had lost loved ones or that they were still fighting in the Far East in the war against Japan. All around lay the devastation of war. But over the years, the bomb sites disappeared. Many cities were almost unrecognisable from their pre-war years, and London was no exception. As living memories of the Blitz fade into history, the physical evidence is still to be found, reminding us of a time when the country nearly buckled under the onslaught but ultimately survived.